Hello, it is another Tuesday, which of course means it's time for another in real life video. And this week we are alternating. We're beginning our usual, well, I don't know, is it usual? We're beginning a process wherein we alternate between these ranking videos and these more topical, like talking head, sort of taking a question from general viewers like you. And you can also submit a request for a ranking video. But nonetheless, this week we are taking a general viewer submit question, as was submitted in the comments below and included a question mark, which is exactly what you should do if you also want yours added to the list. Anyway, this week's comes to us from a general viewer whose username should be somewhere in the bottom lower third of your screen right about now. And it reads, they write in saying, in what way are you able to enjoy games like Avowed without the poor game design preventing you from engaging with the story? Are there any games with a good story that you weren't able to enjoy or get immersed in because of poor game design? A very loaded question, especially considering I know Avowed isn't like terribly popular within like the zeitgeist and all of that. And I do think that there's like an issue around that wherein a lot of people have difficulty articulating what they do and do not like about a game and to what degree, right? Even if it's just like in personal conversation, and instead just seek to parrot something that they heard in a YouTube video, right? Or on a podcast or something like that, or whatever your favorite streamer like, then you also kind of like it too. I think I don't have so much of that on a personal level, despite me watching and listening to other folks as well, because a lot of people who I sort of like still do listen to and certainly grew up listening to did not like video games made by Bethesda Game Studios, and I very much do, but I still liked hearing those people's opinions and them sort of explaining them. And we've talked about this before in the far past of these IRL videos, sort of like how to read a review, whether it's like from a more formal publication or from someone like talking into a camera or just from like a friend, you know? The ways in which you sort of look at someone's own taste compared to your own, understand what they're interested in, and weigh it against what you're interested in, you know? But yeah, I kind of don't mind so much. Like, I don't get that too badly, though I do think, like I said, I think a lot of people are guilty of it, whether or not folks admit to it is another question entirely. But I do think, you know, there's a reason why a lot of people, you see folks crop up and say, oh, that's a nice opinion. What YouTuber gave it to you, right? And of course, here I am as well. You know, you should, of course, take my opinion above all else, obviously, right? But regardless, that's neither here nor there. When it comes to Avowed, I actually liked Avowed on the story front and the gameplay front. And if anything, I think I preferred the gameplay over the story in Avowed. Avowed, of course, is a game set in the same universe as Pillars of Eternity. And I think its writing was weaker than the writing of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. Even if you sort of go beyond having a whole bunch of reactivity and branching dialogues and sort of like narrative role-playing game structures within the game. I feel like even just as a story itself, it was a little cut and dry, right? It was straightforward. You can kind of figure out exactly what the story is about and what it's conveying to you in the very first zone, you know? I thought it was okay, the writing, but I actually really enjoyed the gameplay of Avowed. I thought Avowed was some amazing first-person combat gameplay, action RPG stuff going on, you know? I remarked multiple times in that playthrough, wow, it would be cool if other games like Elder Scrolls 6 maybe took some pointers from how they do the combat and how they balance the stats in interesting ways and have like different vectors of building your character and different things you can pull off, like stunning folks, sort of in like almost a Soulsborne type of way, and being able to do like a special attack, I think it was called, having different things scale off of your crit, involving like cool ways mixing and matching the talent tree to where like you're building crits in this way, you're building up random crit chance, you're building up guaranteed crit damage because there are certain attacks in that game that always do crit damage. You want to have like high fire rate, high reload rate, and those also, a lot of that carries over, in my opinion, from Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, which I think also, for being that type of role-playing game, the sort of CRPG, I do think those also had very good gameplay because of like the wide amount of choices afforded to you. And I thought Avowed did a very good job. I really enjoyed fighting and killing stuff in Avowed. I really liked it a lot. So I don't really know what you're talking about. I think you're just wrong. I think you're just wrong on that count. But to sort of hone in on the more meaningful part of the question, are there any games with a good story that you weren't able to enjoy or get immersed in because of poor game design? Which, of course, I think here, when you're saying good game design, you mean like on a more mechanical level, like input output. You know, you press a button on the controller or your keyboard, you click your left mouse button and something happens. You know, that sort of situation, and less so if we're being a bit more all-encompassing, because there's definitely a school of thought wherein you consider the writing to also be part of the game design. You know, if it is a writing-heavy game, I would argue that having satisfying and interesting amounts of reactivity and interesting amounts of branching dialogue is also part of the design. You know, it's a very vague catch-all term that a lot of people just throw around, in particular here on YouTube, right? Without sort of explaining themselves in any interesting way. But regardless, there are some games that are like that. Oftentimes I will even say on the channel, we have played some game, at least, let's see, I even have a list here. Let's see, just as a reminder. Yeah, we played at least one of these games on the channel. But I've also talked about how, as well, depending on like the game itself, sometimes there's like a history or like a tenure involved in the game, in the people who made the game, and as well sort of what would come after that game, not just within a franchise, not just like the ways in which Daggerfall influenced Morrowind, which influenced Oblivion, which influenced Skyrim, you know? Not just that, but more so in the way of, this was like a staple. This was like a formative game within a genre or subgenre. You know, the same way we mentioned Soulsborne stuff before, the way in which like Demon's Souls or Dark Souls 1 influenced a whole bunch of Souls-likes that would come out eventually, you know, stuff like that. Even if you don't like a game mechanically, right, which tends to be the opposite of what you get. Oftentimes it's like a bad story, but the mechanics are so amazing, you can just ignore a mediocre or horrible story. But in either count, there's also a room for, if you're really into the hobby of games, just as it is with, I think, any number of hobbies, if you're really into video games, sometimes you do decide, I'm going to suffer, I mean, it's putting it a little intensely, but I'm going to suffer through something that I don't really care for, right? The writing, it seems obvious where it's going. I completely understand what they're doing from the get-go. Everything seems so, like, playing to trope, playing on tropes and stuff. Same, you could say the same for mechanics. It's so rudimentary or archaic, in fact. There's parts of it that seem like practically draconic in how it's laid out. It seems so, like, outdated. But if you approach it in a more academic sense, there's a realm of being able to appreciate it from that vector, right? From the vector of looking at it more academically and being like, okay, the reason why this game is leaning on these tropes, whether they be mechanical or like story tropes, is because it kind of established these tropes, right? It kind of is the game that started doing this first, and a whole lot of things that came after it, a whole lot of work that came after it, iterated on what was present in that game. Maybe the biggest example of that is something that we have played on this channel, that being Baldur's Gate 1. Baldur's Gate 1, the story of it, like I said, was fairly like rudimentary, and I think it helped quite a bit that the game was maybe like a third of the time or half of the time kind of tongue-in-cheek, to where like sort of the threat of Saravok and whatnot, it was a lot easier to swallow because it felt kind of silly, right? For me, one of the funniest things of all during that playthrough was when there was this big serious conversation with some political figureheads in Baldur's Gate, the city itself, and Saravok shows up and he's trying to like trick everybody, but he's dressed up wearing his like evil guy armor, and he looks so obviously like a nightmare death knight of a monster man, and everyone's just completely hook, line, and sinkered in. But that was funny in and of itself. It was kind of its era, and you can take a step back and appreciate it for what it was at the time, and sort of looking at like how far we have come, sort of looking at like, oh, this was the first Infinity Engine CRPG, you know? You wouldn't have other games that are either in the Infinity Engine or other real-time with pause CRPGs, you know, like Pathfinder, the newer stuff with Alcat. And of course, you wouldn't have like Baldur's Gate, you know, Baldur's Gate 3, the smash hit success. You wouldn't have that without sort of what started there. And you can also look at it in a fun academic way of, well, what kind of worked for BioWare, the creators originally of Baldur's Gate 1, what kind of worked for BioWare there in that game that they brought forward into Baldur's Gate 2, which I thought was a substantially more compelling game. Mechanically somewhat similar, but oh my gosh, narratively, the storyline of Baldur's Gate 2, in my opinion, blew BG1 out of the water. Also, very crucially, and one of the biggest sticking points for me, or one of the, not sticking points, but one of the things that stuck out to me, I'll say, the most about playing Baldur's Gate 2 is how much they started leaning into character writing and like making use of writing and like storylines and character development and just intrigue with your slew of companions, giving them just like making them feel more like fleshed out characters throughout the entire game, and having it to where like, oh, now you have a side quest with this companion. Oh, they're going to interject here. Sometimes these companions will talk to each other. That's super cool. And it's even more fun having played future BioWare games from like their golden era in 3D games. You know, you're sort of like Dragon Age or Mass Effect, which those games, I think very heavily, a lot of the good writing in those games leans heavily onto character writing, right? A lot of the most memorable stuff for many folks isn't just like, when you first meet Sovereign, the Reapers and all of this stuff, going to what's it called, the under place and fighting the wild monster down there where the dwarves hang out in Dragon Age. A lot of that stuff is sometimes memorable or not, but one of the things that folks most touch on with like golden era 3D BioWare are the companions, is the companion writing. People, one of the main like water cooler things you talk about with other people who have played that game is like, well, who was your squad, right? Who did you travel around with? Who did you romance? All of that good stuff. Who died perhaps in your party? That's some of the most compelling stuff, and you can totally see like a connective line from Baldur's Gate 2 and from Baldur's Gate 1 of where they sort of like continually kept iterating on this idea of like hyping up and building up the slew of companions. And we would go on to have like so many other action RPGs wherein a load of effort is poured into the companions and all of that. And sometimes, you know, it wouldn't work out, right? There was, what was it? There was that infamous, they were trying to really evoke Mass Effect, and because this was kind of like at the height of popularity of Mass Effect, I would say. It was that XCOM spin-off, not like actual XCOM where it's like very tactical and like overhead camera and whatnot. It was the XCOM third-person shooter, like squad-based tactics spin-off, right? They're very much going for Mass Effect. It was The Bureau. XCOM The Bureau. Was it also Declassified? XCOM Declassified The Bureau? XCOM The Bureau Declassified? Something like that. Either way, that didn't work out quite as well, but it's an example of seeing how much games and work in this medium they sort of take from each other and sort of like influence one another and iterate upon one another. Which, you know, if you're not terribly into games and all of that, I understand you probably wouldn't want to take time out to go play a game purely like academically, you know, to just see like, oh, this is very fun. Well, this is maybe less fun for me. I'd rather be playing something else a bit newer or something a bit more storied, something a bit more at the top of everyone's recommendation list. But I do enjoy the idea of, you know, popping in and playing Baldur's Gate 1 because what's there, although it's kind of outdated and whatnot, it's very fun. If you're into the hobby, you know, then it's very fun to see the connective tissue. Another really, really good example of this, I haven't played it on the channel, at least not yet. There's been like rumors of them doing a remake or remaster, which it definitely needs one, right? Because even back in its heyday, it was a pain. And I believe speaking of connective tissue, we just brought up Dragon Age Origins. I believe this game, was it not on like a somewhat modified version of the same exact engine that Dragon Age Origins was on? That is, you know, if you're very much into this type of shit, you probably already know what I'm about to say. The Witcher 1. The Witcher 1 is a fantastic example of this, I think. And maybe like my standout example, wherein it's not just that the story was very compelling, but it does have some very fun story moments toward the end, and there's some like very fun side quests and all of that, side quest arcs in Witcher 1. But my God, the gameplay in Witcher 1 is so god awful. It is so horribly bad. It's borderline impossible to enjoy, I think. But it is so rough. The way in which I personally got through it, and I think maybe this is illustrative of the fact that you have to go like on a case-by-case basis. I hate to say it, but you know, I think there may be some nuance involved. But for me, what I did is I looked up sort of like, how can I just ignore this combat that I hate, right? How can I get through the game and still enjoy it and have like a competent way of building out my character, building out Geralt, and still enjoy my time with the game? And what I did is there was this one build wherein you sort of, was it Igni or Ignis? You just build out using his fire Witcher magic, his Witcher sign, and you could just spam that and basically clear the entire game on maximum difficulty by just like running around in circles around dudes, and then when it came off a cooldown, you just hit them with the big fire blast, right? I did that throughout the entire damn game, and it was mechanically such a slog. It is, like I said, is probably the greatest example I can think of it being mechanically like god awful. but you know, the storyline was satisfactory and was very fun in some points. I think there's even folks who make a strong case for The Witcher 2 also being guilty of this, but I would challenge people who say that by responding with, well, you haven't played Witcher 1, right? I understand what you're saying, but if you had played Witcher 1, you would know how far beyond Witcher 2 is from that initial Witcher 1 experience. You know, and then Witcher 3, of course, there's even people who make a case for that. There's even people who are like, Witcher 3, I can't even play because the third-person controls, they don't make any sense to me. They just don't add up, right? It's too weird. Which is, you know, there's different levels of accessibility and people with like different amounts of video game literacy to be able to get into these things, right? Fair enough. Such is the way of how indicative of it that it is. With, I think, Witcher 3 hitting sort of this immense degree of popularity, you had a lot of people trying it out who normally this game would not be in their like sphere of interest, but it sort of escaped its usual demographics, and a whole bunch of people tried it out. And a whole bunch of people bounced off of it, right? Because of those exact reasons. And a fun way that a lot of people who still were really compelled by like the storytelling, the writing, and all of that in those games, you just set it on easy. You know, you just set it on easy and you kind of slog your way through combat. Not entirely unlike what I did with Witcher 1, right? I just looked up how to effectively make the game super easy. I think I still played through it on super hard. I think I still played through it on like max difficulty just for kicks. But that's how powerful going like full Igni was in that game, at least to my memory. There were a few fights where you couldn't use it, and my god, that shit sucked, right? There were a few fights where like they were either resistant to fire damage or magic didn't work or whatever. And it kind of sucked. I remember that happening in like a swamp area or something. That was, man, that was really rough. I remember running through some swamps. That shit sucked. Either way, there's some other ones which I think there's decent cases for. On the channel, Planescape Torment is one that we played recently, wherein mechanically there's a case for you to say like, yeah, it's somewhat lackluster, especially as you really begin ascending in levels, right? It gets to be kind of monotonous, but the storyline conversely is pretty dang compelling. Same you could say for, I think there's a good case to be made for the Telltale games during their sort of heyday with like The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, there's that Batman one. All those Telltale games, mechanically, for what they are, I think also kind of stink, right? This is kind of my hot take is their gameplay, which you could, you know, if you're just surface level, you're just being like, oh yeah, of course the gameplay in the Telltale games sucked, because a lot of time it was just you walking like Lee around an environment and clicking on everything you could, and then occasionally you picked one of 4 things or you let the timer run out, you know? I hear you on that, but that's not what I mean. More so, I mean, those Telltale games sort of set you up with an idea of this is a narrative-heavy game, and there's a whole bunch of branching storylines and dialogue choices, but at the end of the day, there's only like a handful of them that really matter, because it would be absurd to expect them to make, like, the amount of investment in the game would become astronomical if you were expected to, like, every single time there was a reasonable, like, divergence in the storyline, they had to go and flesh that out or whatever, right? But alas, without that there, it meant that there wasn't the kind of degree of reactivity or branching storylines that I would have liked, which are present in a lot of CRPGs, right? It just wasn't present in a lot of those Telltale games. A lot of the differences were very minute. That folks often talk about this sort of like, is it a bottle design wherein you kind of have like the same starting point and then it fans out a bit, and then by the end of the game, you've only got like 2 or 3 different endpoints that are in any way meaningful. The Telltale games, super guilty of that, but the storyline in and of itself, even like aside from the degree of reactivity or whatnot and branching storylines, the storylines I felt were very good, right? The Walking Dead Season 1, Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 1, I thought absolutely astounding, right? Some very, very good storytelling. Fantastic characters, right? It's a banger, all-timer. But, you know, the gameplay, not great, even if you want to, even beyond just sort of looking at surface level and being like, well, there's not really much gameplay to it. Well, if you look at the sort of what are you engaging with, you know? When you make a choice, how different does the game play out? And oftentimes, not too differently. Right? At the end of the day, there's a bit of a reset between each episode and all of that, you know? But that doesn't, I feel like that doesn't detract from the overall enjoyment, at least that I had. There's other ones here. There's like, To the Moon was a fun one that I had heard of. I looked on, what was it? I think I looked up a few lists that people had curated, and that was one that I definitely played and agreed with. To the Moon is sort of like, was it made in RPG Maker? I think it was. But the gameplay of it was extremely awful, right? There was like a few puzzles here and there, but most of all, it was like meant to be a narrative experience, right? And I enjoyed it for that. I thought it was a very moving game, but mechanically just wasn't there. There's other stuff like what I saw a bunch of people referencing were the old school like horror games with the tank controls. Those being games where like the story is very fun, but the gameplay itself is kind of ass because of the tank controls, right? Even back in the day, I remember not liking them a lot because of the tank controls. It was not why I was into it. It was a lot of the, you know, the storyline, but also like the atmosphere, the vibe. You know, we talked about this a little bit with when bringing up The Witcher 1. You know, sometimes there's also just like the world building, the feel of the world, the aesthetic, the vibe overall throughout the game is also in some ways, depending on the game, can be very meaningful, can kind of carry a game pretty damn far if the like aesthetic and vibe is very, very on point. But I think that just about covers it. Let me double check here. Let's see. Yeah. Normally, like I said, you hear it going the other way around, where folks are keen to talk about, yeah, this game has a terrible story, but mechanically, man, it's awesome. It feels so good to play Rebel Galaxy and hear the music blasting and taking your starship and flying around and blasting other starships. But man, I don't know what the hell that story was about. Something to do with my aunt. Some along those lines. But that's a fantastic example of it right there. But yeah, I think the more you're into the hobby, the more you're going to be into approaching things academically. Perhaps the more patience you'll have. You know, I feel like nothing screams like I'm a tourist in this hobby than, oh, I'm willing to just throw my hands up and turn around and leave at the first sign of a little bit of friction, you know? Depending on how much you are into the hobby or even like the subgenre within the hobby, that being like role-playing games or whatever, you're willing to put up with a little bit more to sort of find the good, find the fun. And I think that's maybe also something that varies person to person. It is kind of a skill to develop as well, your ability to play a game and find the fun. This is why for some folks, games with like emergent gameplay elements, they enjoy those more because you have sort of like the sandbox experience and you're able to have fun like messing around with the toys in the sandbox. For some people, that clicks a lot more because they have that skill a bit more high up. They've leveled that skill up a bit more than some. And I do think that in some ways making videos or like streaming or something along those lines, it does sometimes ask of you to find the fun, right? Because, you know, at the end of the day, you're trying to like show something off or be entertaining or whatever you're doing with the overall idea behind the video or stream or whatever. And thus you're probably a little bit better at finding the fun, or at least hopefully you are at finding the fun than an average person would be, you know, because it's a bit of a skill and you've maybe developed and honed it however slightly more so than they have, you know? But I think that covers all of our bases. I think that covers everything when it comes to this question. Right. Like I said, kind of a loaded one. I liked Avowed mechanically, right? Maybe that's an unpopular opinion, but I thought that mechanically, gameplay wise, I thought it was better than the storyline, which I thought was okay. You know, a lot of my favorite parts of the storyline of Avowed are just, you know, taking things I already enjoyed from Pillars of Eternity, you know, and sort of exploring them a little bit differently. But mechanically, I really enjoyed it mechanically. All right, that ought to do it. As I had said at the top of this one, feel free to submit requests for rankings. We'll probably do a ranking one next week, but don't let that stop you from submitting a question for a similar video as to this one. Anyway, until next time, please take care of each other.